Morning in Paradise. Let's start with a very simple chant and a little bit of a sit. And the chant is this. In the Buddhist tradition, there's a text called The Heart of Perfect Wisdom that is, the big version is 80,000 verses, and then it's summed up in 8,000 verses and in 880, but it's also summed up in one syllable, which saves a lot of study on your part. And the one syllable for the perfection of wisdom is the seed syllable ah in Sanskrit. And the reason that it represents wisdom is that it's the sound of opening or letting go. It's considered the first sound in life and the last sound. So let's sing ah for a bit, just keep the note going, and then we'll sit in the stillness following it. I don't know which I like better, the sweetness when the ah goes on for a while and the harmony kicks in and you feel all that kind of resonance together, or the silence afterward with the bird song and the sailboat sails flapping in the wind. We're sailing somewhere, you know, around the Milky Way galaxy for sure. So this morning, just trying to feel into what might be important in this work of trust that we're doing together. And here we sit for a moment, a minute, quietly, and let the sounds come and go and the feelings come and go. Often beautiful feelings. We're here, gratitude, but all kinds of other stuff that makes up our life. The unfinished business comes and knocks at the door of the heart saying, hey, you're quiet now, let's deal with this stuff. You know, it does. Things in the body. And the openness that we invite includes it all. Alexander Solzhenitsyn writes, it were so simple, if only there were evil people somewhere committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through every human heart. And who among us is willing to destroy a piece of our own heart? So when you open, you remember, you can touch into the reality that you are consciousness. You're not the body. Consciousness was born into this body and will leave the body at some point, you know, like Avis, you rent it for a while, but you don't get to keep it. And the consciousness contains it all. It's what you are. There's a beautiful song, if I could sing. Oh, Krishna Das, thank you. He does it for us, for me anyway, by Mike Scott, called Bring 'Em All In. And the verse, the chorus of it is bring 'em all in, bring 'em all in, bring 'em all into my heart. And then here are some of the verses. Bring the little fishies, bring the sharks, bring them from the brightness, bring them from the dark, bring them out of purdah, bring them out of store, bring them out of hiding, lay them at my door. Bring the unforgiven, bring the unredeemed, bring the lost and nameless, let them all be seen, bring them all in, bring them all into my heart. And it's one of my new favorite kirtan kind of spiritual songs, because it invites somehow us to remember that it's us, that those are parts of ourselves in the greatest sense, and also in the limited sense of the kind of weird person that you are, unlike all the rest of us, right? And then the question is, with the world in the difficulties that we see, politically, socially, the kind of racism and injustice and climate disruption and all of these things, it's very clear that no amount of science and technology is going to fix it. You know, nanotechnology and computers and biotechnology and space technology, it's not going to stop warfare and stop racism, stop environmental destruction. The only thing that's going to make a difference is a change of heart and change of consciousness in humanity. We are, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, a nation of nuclear giants and ethical infants. And it's maybe time to get at least to kindergarten or something like that. Sitting with blocks, use your words, please. You know, go up the chain of command a ways with that one. But how can we trust then in this world which has its tears and its sorrows? And tomorrow I want to talk more about healing and service and things like that, but I'm going to start with forgiveness today. Because without forgiveness, whether it's the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda, or the Northern Irish Protestants and Catholics, or the Bosnians and Serbs and Croats, or the Palestinians and Israelis, to say, your people marched, you know, through our neighborhood in Ireland and 400 years ago, we'll never forget that, and your people did this to my people and we'll never forget. And you're chained to the past. How do you trust when people have caused you harm, when you have suffered, when they've suffered? But at some point, somebody has to say, it stops with me. I will not continue this. And I remember doing some peace work in Palestine and Israel, and on the back side of that huge 25-foot concrete wall that divides Palestine and Israel in parts anyway, and that unfortunately cuts through olive groves of the Palestinians and all kinds of beautiful land that had belonged to farmers and people there. There's graffiti, cool graffiti. There's a big graffiti of an olive grove that says, you may have cut us down, but we still see all the trees and we will never forget. And my favorite is an image that I just have a photo of a peace stub. You can't really see it back there probably, but it's probably 20 feet high, with an olive branch in its mouth, and it's wearing a flak jacket, a bulletproof vest, as if to say, okay, you know, a little trouble over here, but I'm coming, you know, no matter what, I'm on the way. So how do we trust? Without trust, and without forgiveness, and without a sense that there's another possibility in our life, we're bound to, caught in the past. There isn't freedom to love. Gandhi, who puts it this way, says, "When I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love has always won. There have been murderers and tyrants, and for a time they can seem invincible, but in the end they always fall. Think of it, always." And there's some trust in Gandhi in the greater picture, the moral arc of the universe. It may be long, but it bends toward justice. Some sense that who we are knows what's possible for us as human beings. And this is the freedom of the heart, the freedom to trust, the freedom to love. Now, of course, you know, things get difficult. And you think when the difficult people mistreat us and difficult things come, how can we trust? This is from a Indian saint who writes, "Go ahead, light your candles, burn your incense, ring your bells, call out to the gods," as you've been doing in the evenings, right? But watch out, because the gods will come. And they will put you on the anvil and fire up the forge and beat you until they turn brass into pure gold. And so sometimes it's the very sufferings and the difficulties that are the avenue to learn who you really are, to remember forgiveness, to remember your capacity for freedom of spirit no matter what happens to you. Like Nelson Mandela proves, they can put your body in prison, but no one can imprison your spirit. And I was, as a monk, you know, in the early years, part of the reason I went was to deal with my own pain. Family suffering, terribly abusive father, violent, unpredictable, raging, a wife batterer who was, you know, really painful and difficult. It wasn't until I got to college and really started to talk to other people that I realized, oh, we're not the only, you know, weird family. There's lots of them out there. Now I know. But it felt very isolating too. And how was I to deal with the rage and grief and anger and confusion and all of that? That was partly why I began the spiritual practice, just trying to heal. And so I was working with that in my own inner life, to how to forgive my father. And of course it partly helped to realize, to look back and see how his father was and how his mother and his grandparents, and see the lineage of suffering. And also his mental problems, that he actually had a kind of mental illness. He was very smart, but I met a lot of smart people who are not terribly wise. You know how that goes. And so I started to soften my heart, and then I worked with this wonderful monk who I lived with in the forest monasteries in Thailand, named Mahagosananda. And just as Ramdas tells these origin stories, these beautiful origin stories of his spiritual life, this is one for me. Gosananda spoke 15 languages. He was a scholar and you know, just a lovely spirited fellow and a meditator. I didn't really understand who he was. He was a friend and we practiced together. And then the Cambodian genocide happened and so many people were killed. 2 million people killed. And he was out of the country when it happened. So as soon as the refugees poured out, went to the refugee camps on the Cambodian border, where there were hundreds of thousands of people seeking safety. And in the refugee camps, Kosananda said, well, we have to open Buddhist temple for them because they've lost everything. And it wasn't they. All 19 members of his family were killed. His village temple was burned. Many of the monks, all the intellectuals, were all killed. And here he was, this scholar meditator. So we got permission from the UNHCR to open this little temple in the middle of one of the camps to start with, and others, Sakeo. It was a roof and a platform and a place to put an altar. And the Khmer Rouge in the camp said, if anyone goes to this temple, because there was a Khmer Rouge underground, when we get out of here, you will be shot. And, you know, it was a very serious threat. So we didn't know if anyone would come, but the morning it opened, went through the camp in a truck slowly ringing this gong, 100,000 people in their little bamboo huts. And people streamed into the square and filled it, 25,000 people or more. Gosananda sat there and looked out on this crowd, and the faces of people, a grandfather with two nieces, that was all that was left of the family, you know, an auntie and, you know, a couple of the children from her sister's family, and the faces of trauma. And I thought, what can he say to them? And he put his hands together and he began to chant in Cambodian and in Pali, like Sanskrit, that one of the first verses of the Buddha: hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is healed. This is the ancient and eternal law. And he chanted it, and many of them hadn't heard these words for some years because the temples were burned and all this was made impossible. And so first they heard their chants sung again, and then they heard the words. And pretty soon they joined him, and 25,000 people were singing together, hatred never ends by hatred, but by love alone is healed. And I sat there and I felt like he was speaking a truth. This is the ancient and eternal law. He was speaking a truth that was even bigger than their tears, even bigger than their suffering. And for the next 15 years, he led peace walks through the killing fields and the minefields to take people back to their villages on foot, chanting loving kindness the whole way. He said, you have to reclaim your land. You can't just return. You have to reclaim it with your heart. So this is where I started to learn forgiveness, really. I thought, okay, my dad, nothing, you know. It needed forgiveness, but when people start to learn it, there's a kind of dignity that comes with it. And I remember a woman who was in the middle of a tough divorce, very difficult one. She'd been married to a very high-powered lawyer. He had the affair, but he was trying to keep all the money and the children and turn them against her, and all the messy things that can happen in a very bad divorce. And naturally, in working with her, I counseled her to get an equally tough lawyer, or more so if she could. And she struggled with it and with trying to stay centered and wise. And one day she came in and she talked about how he was using the children, turning them against her in some way. And she looked at me and said, I've made a decision. I will not bequeath a legacy of bitterness to my children. It will stop with me. And I could feel the dignity of that spirit to say those words and to hold it in her heart. That yes, I will bear the suffering, I'll bear witness to it, I will carry it, but I will not pass it on to my children, to other human beings. It's like Yeats, who writes in his dialogue of self or soul, I am content to follow to its source every event in action and thought of his life. Measure the lot. Forgive myself the lot. When such as I cast out remorse, so great a sweetness flows into my breast, for we must laugh and we must sing. We are blessed by everything. Measure the lot. Forgive myself the lot. Because it turns out that the only force that's really able to free us and to free the world is the force of love. And the force of love comes from the truth that we're all connected, but also, you know, here it is, Martin Luther King, after the church was bombed and children were killed. We will match your capacity to inflict suffering with our capacity to endure suffering. We will meet your physical force with soul force. We will not hate you, but we cannot in all good conscience obey your unjust laws, and we will soon wear you down by our capacity to suffer. And in winning our freedom, we will so appeal to your heart and conscience that we will win your freedom as well. So what is forgiveness? It's really important to understand before we do this forgiveness practice that we'll do. The first is, it doesn't mean that we condone what happened. It's not saying forgive and forget. In fact, it's quite the opposite. You say, I see it clearly, and I will do everything in my power to prevent this suffering from continuing. I'll stand up for the injustice. I will protect people, and I will also protect myself. I won't let this happen to others, and I won't let it happen to me. And I think of a man, Arturo, who I worked with, who came, whose family had a big construction business, and when his father died, the siblings, his brothers, kind of were fighting over the inheritance and trying to take a lot of his money. And he said, how can I trust them? He sat with it for a while. I said, well, what can you trust? He said, well, I can trust that they'll be themselves, which includes trying to take my money. I said, so how would you respond wisely to that? He said, get a good lawyer. I think, sorry, we're back at that theme. I said, what else can you trust? He said, I can trust that I have, 12 nieces and nephews, and I've been to their birthdays and their quinceañeras and all that, and I trust that I love them all. And so I'll get a good lawyer, and I'll love them. And that was his response to it. So you protect yourself, and you protect others. It's not condoning it. And also, it's not a weakness. In fact, it says in the Bhagavad Gita, if you want to see the brave, look to those who can forgive. If you want to see the heroic, look to those who can offer love instead of hatred, or in response to hatred. So it's actually an act of dignity and courage. And it's not a quick fix. The teacher who gave me the practice of forgiveness said, do it, a couple times a day, 5-10 minutes, we'll do it soon. And try it for 6 months, come back and tell me how it's going. So I did a little math, and I thought, wait, 6 months, twice a day, that's 500 times. Or 300 times. The man who wrote to the IRS saying, I haven't been able to sleep because I cheated on my taxes last year, so I've enclosed an anonymous cashier's check for $3,000. If I still can't sleep, I'll send the rest. I mean, that's how we are as human beings, right? And so it's a little bit at a time, and you forgive, and then you say, no, I'll never forgive this person, never gonna do it. But then you realize, do you want to keep your heart closed? Do you want to put someone out of your heart? And you realize that it's never too late to forgive. Never, ever. The man was my age, but looked much older. He was an Army vet, homeless, cold, hungry. I could see he tried to wash up before coming to the social services department where I worked for help. His face and hands were clean, but his clothes were filthy. Though he claimed not to have any alcohol that day, the smell of it seeped from his pores. I wanted to get him into rehab, and I asked if he was ready to come in off the streets. No, ma'am, he said, all I'd like is a few dollars and some bus tickets. If I can get sober enough, they'll let me into the shelter across town. That shelter had 50 beds, cots. The homeless were admitted at night, forced out at dawn to eat breakfast at a nearby charity. 50 beds, and nearly 1,000 homeless in this part of the small city. Winters here mean cold, rain, and mud. Even though this man and many like him slept under bridges to keep dry, the dampness penetrated everything. His clothes, the bedroll he carried on the floor smelled moldy. The pages of a book he carried were swollen. I asked him how many times he tried rehab. 2 or 3, he said, a long time ago. Maybe it's time to try again. I explained I had a client who'd gone through the program 7 times before it took. Besides, I said, we're months away from warmer weather. What else have you got going on? I watched his face as he considered my offer. I thought I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes, followed by a shadow of doubt. He'd tried before. It had been hard, impossibly hard, so he was living on the streets. Finally, he lifted his head and looked at me. I reached for the phone. Shall I asked. He barely nodded yes. An hour later, I handed him over to a recovering alcoholic, also a veteran, who would drive him to one of the best rehabs in the county. "Come visit me when you graduate," I said as they left. I barely recognized the man when he came into my office 6 months later, so tall and handsome, smelling like the outdoors, holding a huge bouquet of flowers. It's never too late. It's never too late to start over. It's never too late to forgive. And mostly, it's not for others. They have their own karma to work out. It's like the two ex-prisoners of war who talk to each other, been through all the terrors of the prison camp and so forth. 20 years later, have you forgiven your captors? One says, no, never, responds the other. Well then, they still have you in prison, don't they? It's really for ourselves to not put another out of our heart. Or as someone says, to give up all hope for a better past, right? It was what it was. And a big part of the art of forgiveness is forgiving you-know-who. Moi, as Miss Piggy would say. Yeah, this one. So much shame, so much self-judgment, so much how I'm supposed to be, how I was supposed to perform, who I'm supposed to be. An epidemic of self-judgment and self-hatred. And Trudy and I were just teaching in China and teaching before in Singapore and working with some people from Korea. There is an epidemic of suicide among young people. Korea, Singapore, some in China. One child pushed the level of ambition. Oh, you didn't do well on the test, your life is over, our whole family is destroyed. All the kind of fantasies that are placed on these poor kids. But fantasies have been placed on you too. And you internalize them, how you're supposed to be, who you're supposed to be. So this from dear friend Frank Ostaseski. He writes about, Frank Ostaseski started the Zen Center Hospice. And he writes about a patient who was dying there, Matthew, raised in a fundamentalist Christian family. The commandments of a punishing God had literally been beaten into him by his fire and brimstone preacher father. Now, believing he was close to death, he felt certain God would condemn him for eternity in hell due to his sexual orientation. I tried to support Matthew, orienting him to mindfulness and compassion practices that he'd studied in Buddhism. We created an altar at his bedside, put a Buddha there and a tanka. When that failed to calm him, I held his hand, massaged his feet, played his favorite chants. Still no change. Finally, the doctor ordered a sedative. Even that didn't work. Matthew was spinning in a world of confusion, shame, and dread of hell for who he was. By 2 in the morning, I was exhausted and went home to sleep, and on the drive there, I thought of my first Holy Communion as a Catholic. It ushers young innocence into the loving lap of God. I got home and searched through my closet, and there I located in my memento box a 5-inch plastic figure of Jesus surrounded by lambs and little children. Instead of going to bed, I drove back over to the hospital, and as Matthew continued to moan and shout and toss in agony, I took down the tanka, put away the Buddha, and replaced it with the small plastic statue of Jesus. Just as I was smoothing the altar cloth, a cleaning woman named Dina came into the room and spotted the figurine. Setting her mop to the side, she said with great enthusiasm, "Merciful Jesus, when his kindness is with us, everything is all right." And I could see as Matthew's face pivoted toward the altar, his gaze at the plastic Jesus, and back at Dina's direction, a smile came, his entire body relaxed. In that moment, the punishing God of his childhood, whose wrath he'd been taught to fear, made him feel like a terrible person, was transformed into the merciful God he also knew and loved, who adored all his children, accepting, benevolent. Dina's faith in God's love was so secure that it lent Matthew exactly the strength he needed to defeat this inner curse. I left them together there. They didn't need me any longer. So in the end, the redemption is really for this one, for you, for all the things that you tried to live up to and are supposed to be and were imagining. You know, in Hawaii, in the Big Island, there's a place called Puahonu'ohonau now, the city of refuge. And no matter what you had done, what taboo you'd broken, even if you killed someone, if you could get yourself into the temple of refuge, you would be forgiven. I remember going there, walking and thinking, does this place still work? You know? And then I thought, what if we built temples of refuge instead of the thousands of racist poverty prisons where we're locking up so many people? Isn't there another way to live in this world? Because what forgiveness does is it opens us to vastness, to the consciousness that we are, that we all contain darkness and light and joy and sorrow, and as Solzhenitsyn said, the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And then we can be amused and dignified and gracious because we say, yes, this is us, this is who we are as humanity. And I remember Ram Dass at Naropa Institute in the first summer in 1974, there was I think it was full moon, maybe Guru Purnima Day, and there was a huge bonfire, 1,000, 2,000 people went out, a Kali fire, and people were going to write down things that they needed to let go of. But Ram Dass stood there beforehand as the kind of the priest that he was with his beard and white garb at the time, Baba Ram Dass. And if you wanted to confess anything, you confessed it to him on the way to putting your paper in the fire. The line was long, you know. It was a long, long line, and he just stood there being the space of love that said yes and, yes and, yes and, until people could feel that love from his eyes and, okay, now I release this and let this go. Bring them all into the heart, and transform them with your forgiveness. Mostly forgiving yourself. And turns out when you can forgive yourself, that it somehow changes how you are with other people. So let's do a little practice. 10 minutes. I asked Ram Dass what were all those people confessing on the way to the fire. But like a good priest, he wouldn't tell me. It was so moving, though, to see that. You know, to see that people wanted to say, wanted to be witnessed, and wanted to be loved anyway. You know, it's so beautiful. So let your eyes close gently. And forgiveness has 3 directions to it. Well, first, quiet your mind, tend your heart just a little bit with your breath, relaxing, as Trudy instructed. The first direction. There are many ways in which I have hurt and harmed others, knowingly or unknowingly, betrayed them, abandoned them, caused them pain. We've all done this. I remember these now and feel the sorrows that I carry for causing this suffering. Let yourself remember. And now choose one for this morning, especially to ask forgiveness of another. And in the ways and in this way that I've hurt or harmed another, out of my confusion and pain, out of my fear and hurt, out of my anger and ignorance, in whatever way I may have caused you harm, knowingly and unknowingly, in this moment, I ask your forgiveness. I ask your forgiveness. Please forgive me. May I be forgiven. And sense and know that you can be forgiven. That we've all betrayed others as we've all been betrayed. Part of the human dance. In the ways I've hurt you out of my own fear and confusion and pain. Ignorance, please forgive me. And in the second direction of forgiveness, you can feel how naturally, as you ask forgiveness of others, you need to forgive yourself. So just as I've hurt or harmed others, betrayed them, abandoned them, caused them pain, so too I've abandoned myself, betrayed myself, caused myself pain so many ways out of my confusion and fear and hurt. I remember these now too. And let yourself feel the ways that you have, out of your pain and confusion, harmed yourself. Remember it and hold it with tenderness. And in the ways that I've hurt or harmed myself, knowingly and unknowingly, out of my confusion and pain, out of ignorance and fear and hurt, anger. In this moment, I forgive myself. I hold myself with tenderness and mercy. If you want, you can even put a hand in your heart. Breathing gently in this moment. I offer myself a tender forgiveness. I forgive myself. And sense that you can forgive yourself. Like Yeats, you can measure the lot, forgive yourself the lot. That there's a blessing in the forgiveness. To hold yourself with so much love and tenderness, this human life. And the third direction, just as you ask forgiveness of others and extend it to yourself. There are many ways that others have hurt and harmed me. We've all been betrayed, abandoned me, caused me pain, made me suffer. It happens. I remember these now too. Let yourself feel the sorrows you still carry from these betrayals. And think of one that it's time to forgive this morning. It doesn't have to be the most difficult, although it could be, but one that the heart says, it's time to let this go and be free. And in this way, as in many ways, that you have hurt or harmed me, caused me pain, knowingly and unknowingly, out of your confusion and out of your own hurt, and ignorance, out of your pain and anger and fear. In this moment, I see you with my heart. I offer you forgiveness. To the extent that I'm ready, I forgive you. I forgive you. To the extent that I'm ready, I release you. I offer you forgiveness. And feel the dignity and the openness of forgiveness. To ask it of others. To forgive yourself. And to forgive those who have caused you pain. If you want to see the brave, says the Bhagavad Gita, look to those who can forgive. Bring it all into your loving heart. One last thing to say, that with all these practices of the heart, compassion practice, loving kindness, forgiveness, joy, which we'll do some tomorrow, sometimes they work beautifully and you feel this tender forgiveness for yourself or others. Sometimes they feel very mechanical, they don't work at all. Sometimes they bring up their opposite. I'm never going to forgive that SOB. It ain't gonna happen, you know. I mean, I would be a fool to forgive that, or oh, that's an unforgivable. And the point isn't to have a particular response. The point is to plant the seeds of forgiveness, to turn the heart in that direction. And when all that stuff comes up, I'm never gonna forgive, I hate them. What do? You hold that with forgiveness. Let me hold all of that too with forgiveness. All of it with compassion. This is just us, kind of railing our way, trying to find our way to live with an open heart.
Thank you, Jack. That's beautiful. I can even forgive you for taking some of my time.
Thank you,
it was
dear.
that beautiful. Yeah. It was. Okay.
I freely offer it back to you, dear. Thank you for your forgiveness.
I wanted to tell you some stories about trust and experience. And now that we've all forgiven ourselves and our hearts are open and clean and clear, and we can just, trust our experience. And I'll start with a really happy experience. And this is a story about my grandson, because the kids, Jack and I, have been enjoying so much the presence of the children here. Of course, they're not ours, but just seeing, moms juggling babies who are squawking a little bit outside, and realizing that the ability to trust comes from that experience of being held through all the storms of hunger and wet diapers and the things that torment us when we're infants. And when we feel when a baby cries, I mean, most of us do not go, and drop the baby. We hold the baby. And that impulse to hold the baby, our experience as the baby of being held, pretty much no matter what comes later, that is our first experience of trust in our capacity to be and to be with experience through the parents lending us that holding and stability that we can then learn, even though it may take us our whole lives, to offer to ourselves. So this is a story about my grandson, who is about twice this age now. He's had his bar mitzvah, he's got hairy legs, but this is when he was still in his car seat. And I had picked him up at school, but he was in a shorter day than his sister, his older sister. And so we would wait for her to come out of her class and sometimes go to the playground. And on this day, but I always brought him chocolate milk. And on this day, he didn't want to go outside because he had this Starbucks, no, that's the wrong, Star Wars, wrong star. He had this Star Wars cookbook that he had been waiting for from the library at school. I guess he'd been waiting for weeks, and he was so excited. It was just all desserts, the whole cookbook, and Star Wars, I don't know, brownies. And he was leafing through it. He didn't have to be strapped in because we weren't going anywhere. We were just sitting in the parking lot, and he was leaned back in his car seat. And he had his cookbook in one hand and his chocolate milk and a cookie in his lap. And he just leaned back and he said, "Nini," which is what they call me, "Nini, this is paradise." And I reminded him of that now that he wants, $150 sneakers. But actually, those are cheap. But he's a sneakerhead. But that ability to just relax into experience and to find the goodness in it. And that was an easy moment for him because there was so much goodness in it. The cookie, the chocolate milk, the Star Wars cookbook, our being together, that was a good one. But for us, we can make that kind of relationship with our experience in any moment. Taking a shower, brushing our teeth, just finding the little bits of happiness in it. And for me, in this situation, it's actually gotten easier because I'm kind of on the lookout for little moments of pleasure, actually, that are not painful moments. And that's different from rejecting the painful ones and only one, but just enjoying them, savoring them when they happen. It's really all we need to enter the kingdom of heaven, each one of us. And what is this called? Opening our hearts in paradise. That appreciation and friendship with the present moment. And being able to trust that whatever the contents of that moment, this is it. This is our life. This is the truth of what's happening, the truth happening moment. My Zen teacher, Goodman, who was a Japanese Soto Zen monk, he would teach us all the time, but he was very ordinary, and we were always doing ordinary things before and after retreats together. And one time he was teaching in Sesshin, a 7-day intensive retreat up in Northern California. And I was actually babysitting for my friend Jonelle's children, who the oldest of 3 was 5 years old. And this was, you know, her first retreat in at least 6 years, and or 7. And so because I wasn't really in the Zendo with everybody, I was doing a different kind of practice. Goodman gave me some special time, and I remember we walked down to the creek for me to have a meditation meeting, and we spent the time talking about his family and my family and how everybody was. And then at the end of our meeting, we've been sitting by a dry creek bed on some rocks, and it was kind of sandy, and he stood up and he was brushing off his robes, and he just said, well, this is it. And just for a moment, I caught it. Yeah, this is it. This is the end of our meeting. But no, also, this is it. This moment of just connecting, sharing, being together, standing up, brushing off, getting ready to walk back up the hill to the Zendo. This is it. And this teaching, we could miss these teachings. We miss these teachings all the time. Moment, moment, moment is calling us. This is it. This is it. This is it. But we don't trust that this is it, right? It's hard to trust that this is it. In a story that I really love about a Tibetan, great Tibetan master named Patrul Rinpoche, one of his disciples came and he asked him this question. And the disciples were always asking questions like, what is Buddha? What is the mind? And this was, what is the nature of the mind? And I thought of this question because we were teaching a retreat together at Spirit Rock, and there's a question and answer session in the morning, every morning, and the teacher usually, it depends, but we alternate answering those questions. And so you're sitting up there and you never know what someone's going to ask. And in this case, somebody raised their hand and asked this teacher, what is the nature of mind? What is this consciousness? And she kind of laughed and said, wow, you're getting all deep on me. And everybody chuckled. But I thought about this story when Patrul Rinpoche's student asked him that perennial question that we have, like, what is this? He asked the student to come practice and study with him. And as often happens in these stories, many, many years went by. In this case, 28 years went by. And, you know, he's the disciple. They live together. They're doing all the things you do in a monastery, traveling, going on pilgrimage. And so they're on pilgrimage. And Patrul Rinpoche, who was an intense practitioner, like, he made the vow not to ever sleep indoors. And that's a much harder vow to keep in the Himalayas than it would be here on Maui, to not sleep indoors. So one night they were sort of bedded down and looking at the stars, and Rinpoche said to his disciple, do you see the stars? You know, countless stars. They didn't have light pollution in the mountains of Tibet centuries ago. Just countless stars, like floating in Ram Dass's pool at night, he was talking about. And so his disciple said yes. And he said, do you hear the dog barking in the distance? And they were up above a valley in this little town below. Do you hear that dog barking in the distance in the valley? The disciple said, yeah. And then remember she said, this is it. This is it. And he shouted it to get Yosha Longtok's attention. Because if he had just said, you know, this is it, they're kind of falling asleep. that moment might slip by. But that was the moment of answering his disciples' question. What is the nature of mind? That the contents of this consciousness, of our awareness, in this very moment, whatever you're thinking or feeling, these are the contents of our awakening to this moment, to our not missing that this is it, you guys. This is a poem, actually from a poet who lives in Jackstown, Fairfax, K. Ryan. It's called The Niagara River. As though the river were a floor, we position our tables and chairs upon it, eat, and have conversation. As it moves along, we notice, as calmly as though dining room paintings were being replaced, the changing scenes along the shore. We do know this is the Niagara River, but somehow it's hard to remember what that means. When I was a girl, my grandmother, she had a house that we all shared, all the cousins, on Lake Erie, on the Canadian side in Ontario. And every summer we would make a pilgrimage to Niagara Falls. And as a child, I was fascinated with stories of people who'd gone over the falls in a barrel. But even where we were, which was not far from Fort Erie, where the Peace Bridge is, and where the Lake Erie starts to narrow into the river, we could see the current. You could see the current moving just ever so slowly that way. And then as you drove toward, and we'd take a picnic, and as you drove toward the falls, the current would go faster and faster, and then there'd be little white caps, and then there'd be big rapids, and then there'd be the falls. So this river, it has a particular meaning. But the point is, we're sitting on this river, right? All of us. We're sitting on the Niagara River in our beautiful tent in Maui, enjoying the unspeakably gorgeous scenery of this place and this life we get to share while we're here. And it's easy to forget what that means. This is a poem I love about trust by Linda Paston, very brief part of it. She wrote this poem when her mom was very, very old. And it's called Go Gentle. Remember when you taught me how to swim? Let go, you said. The lake will hold you up. I long to say, Mother, let go, and death will hold you up. I don't know who was teaching yesterday. Our teachings and voices kind of merge about that it's hard that we don't need to be afraid of death. And it's hard to trust that and to surrender our resistance to that. But I think the essence of both of awakening and certainly the essence of enjoying and appreciating our life is this ability to surrender and to trust in the goodness of it, trust that we belong in the goodness of it, that it's not some accident that we find ourselves here, we belong in this. And I've even been practicing trusting pain. After all, pain, right? It's supposed to tell us that pay attention to our bodies and take care. And sometimes it's too much. I have to lie on ice or take ibuprofen or things like that, which is fine. But also in the moments of just being with it, and being able to trust the aliveness of it. The aliveness of it. That actually being with the pain can take us deeper, those difficult experiences. Being with our suffering can take us deeper than appreciating and enjoying the pleasures of here. And Nisargadatta says, acceptance of pain takes you much deeper than pleasure does. The personal self, by its very nature, is constantly pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain. The ending of this pattern is the ending of self. The ending of the self with its desires and fears. And he's not talking about the big self, all of us. He's talking about that small self that compresses, you know, gives us compression fractures of the spirit. The ending of this pattern is the ending of self. The ending of the self with its desires and fears enables you to return to your real nature, the source of all happiness and peace. And the forgiveness practice that Jack led us in, it helps us understand what our friend Wes Nisker, he always says, we are not our fault. And when we can, you know, forgive ourselves, then we can have some of that calm and clarity to trust that this moment, that this is it. You know, the little whirring of the fans and the slight sounds of life from each other, little coughs and rustling, the stillness of just being. And I like to do a practice of that, of just a little bit of stillness in our own being. And when Jack talked about his spiritual teacher of that time, Mahagosananda, it reminded me of traveling with Mahagosananda on a pilgrimage to visit ancient Zen temples in Korea with my Korean Zen master teacher and my former husband, whom I affectionately call my husband. And so we were traveling together, and Mahagosananda was traveling with us, and we went to a great gathering of monastics who wear gray robes in Korea. So there was this sea of gray robes, about 700 monastics and famous teachers from around the country. Maizumi Roshi was traveling with us also, and all the teachers of note would get up and give a Dharma talk, and we couldn't understand the ones in Korean. They weren't being translated because there were very few of us English speakers there. But everybody was obviously giving their very best talk, and a couple of our teachers spoke very eloquently, and Sansanim spoke, and then it was Mahagosananda's turn, and he got up and he stood there in his simple monk's robes, and he had this habit, he always wore, now it got to be kind of a style, these wool caps that you pull down over, you know, like a knitted cap. And he would wear it. It was really hot. He would always wear it in hot weather. So he's standing there in his robes, which were always kind of crumpled and rumpled. He looked sort of like a bag monk. And his hat pulled over, and he stood up to give his talk. And Jack mentioned he spoke 15 languages. He gave it in French. So right there, that's the language of the country that colonized his Cambodia. And he said, and this was his talk, Je suis, tu es, I'll translate, il est, nous sommes, vous êtes, ils sont. Then he said a few more words, but not many. And then he sat down. what he did was he conjugated the verb in French. It's the verb être, to be. And his talk was, I am, you are, he is, she is, we are, you are, they are. So let's just practice for a few moments, just being. Jack led us through a beautiful practice, and let's practice being silent, just being quiet. Being in this moment, trusting that this is it. Life in the form of you. Life in the form of this tent flapping. Just being together. Ding. That was the bell. That was the bell. That was wonderful. Thank you. I could just do this for an hour, but our time together is coming to a close. You know, in terms of trusting and trusting our hearts and trusting experience, I always love this quote by Albert Camus, who said, in the midst of winter, I found an invincible summer. In the steadiness and trust in our own hearts, we can transform the moments. I want to read you a poem by a poet named Julie Price Pinkerton, and she said that she was always, that the certainty of anticipated loss always haunted her. And here's what she did with it, and it really dovetails with this teaching about finding in any moment, you know, something to appreciate and trust. And she says, the whole first half of this poem is pretty much word for word the conversation she had with the guy at Jiffy Lube. Because that's one of our practices, right? We fill the car with gas, it's empty, we take the car to tires, lube, oil. The poem is called Why I Opted for the More Expensive Oil at Jiffy Lube. This one is better for a car as old as yours, he says. It won't glop up, he says. And spring is almost here, so of course you need a thicker oil. And I say, so with this good oil, my car will run better, and it'll be washed and waxed every time I get in it? Yes, he says, and you'll never have to put another drop of gas in it. And when I start the car, a big bag of money will appear in the back seat. Yes, he says, and cash will shoot out your exhaust pipe. And people will be really glad when they see you coming. And will I look rested, like I've gotten plenty of sleep every night? That goes without saying, he says. And when I roll over in bed and look at the man who says he loves me, will I finally believe he loves me? Yes, he says, you won't be able to believe anything else. Your heart will soak up the goodness, and you'll smile and beam and sigh like a pig in mud. And what about my parents, I ask? Excuse me, I miss my parents. Will this oil keep them from dying? They're very old. Let's call them and tell them the happy news, he said. Yeah. So whether it's saying the name of God, repeating over and over again, whether it's being with each breath, moment by moment, breath by breath, whatever our daily practice is, just to trust in the goodness of keeping on doing it. And Suzuki Roshi, wonderful Zen master who wrote, really I think one of the most beautiful, still, it was the second book of meditation we really ever had in the early 70s, called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and it's still one of the deepest and most beautiful. And he really emphasized routine and repetition in the practice. That just doing it over and over and over without expecting any result. That we could trust that something good would happen. And to bring that trust to our practice every day. And maybe we don't have the confidence that everything will just unfold naturally and smoothly, and maybe it doesn't either. But forcing it doesn't help. And he once said that practice is like walking for a long time in a slight mist, or in this very fine drizzle that you almost feel like you're in a cloud here when it happens. You might walk, and you might never feel that you're getting wet. But when you arrive where you're going, you'll notice that your clothes are soaked. And that's how we can trust in our practice, in the moments of our practice, no matter how dull or distracted or boring or routine they might seem to us. But to just trust in, as Layman Pang, great Zen teacher, said, my daily activities are not unusual. I'm just naturally in harmony with them. Grasping nothing, discarding nothing in every place. There's no conflict. My supernatural power and marvelous activity is drawing water and carrying firewood. So our supernatural power and marvelous activity will be to stand up and walk off the stage and make room for the next wonderful teachers to appear. So thank you, everybody.